Hello ladies and gentlemen, Joseph Mogul here. This time, another letter. So, this individual wishes to remain anonymous. And I'm going to respect that, of course. But I need to assign a name because I'm not going to just talk to the computer as if there's nothing going on. So I'm going to call you Chuck. Okay? So, Chuck writes, "Hi Joe, thanks for all the videos you've put out so far. Big fan of your channel." Thank you, Chuck. "I was wondering whether you'd be able to make a video regarding the process of being published, including all the different people and stages and the general timeline of events. You've talked about aspects of being published before, but it'd be nice to know what the process is like and what to expect. Thank you, keep up the great work. P.S. I prefer if you didn't name me in the video." Well, Chuck, I'm not naming you in the video, of course. So, general timeline. Let's see. There really isn't one. My personal experience with being published, response time alone is anywhere from 1 day to 6 months. It really depends on the publishing house, and it depends on what you've chosen to pursue. Obviously, a more popular genre is going to have a lot more people writing in it. So you're going to have to deal with a lot more competition, and therefore there's probably going to be greater delay. Select a more particular or niche category of writing, and your time is probably going to shrink down quite a bit. So, like I said, it really depends. That's the cool thing about writing. There's nothing really set in stone. Everything is a little amorphic. But for a general timeline of events, you start with a story idea. You let the idea marinate, as I call it. I let stories marinate in the back of my mind for quite a while before I write them down. Every writer has their own approach, but you start with the idea, you develop your story, you write your story. Once your story is written, the next stage is proofing and editing. This is where you have people read through and critique your work, correct any grammar or spelling errors that might be there, any sentence or paragraph structure errors that might be there, and you get a whole bunch of different critiques, criticisms, views, comments, etc. on your work. You then compile this because you as the author have final say on everything. If you don't want to use a critique, or you don't think someone's advice is garbage, you can throw it away. You always have that option as an author. Whether or not it's going to get you published is a different story, but you always do have that option as an author because you're an artist and you are trying to express yourself in some form with this. So obviously you have final say. But once you've proofed and edited your work, or had your work proofed and edited for you by other people, as the case will be, then it comes time for submitting your story to various publishing houses or publishing venues. Magazines are another venue they're not actually a publishing house, and there's a whole bunch of e-format publishers now that technically aren't publishing houses per se, but it's still being published. So what will happen with that stage is you submit. That can either be an email, which is the most common form these days, or there are some places that still do this, a physical printed out or typed up copy mailed in. There are very few places that still do that, but they do still exist. Some of them charge a submission fee, which is something I've mentioned in a previous video. It's a little bit of a rip, honestly, but part of the reason for that is that a lot of these places get a really high volume and they don't necessarily make all of their money back, so they have to pay their editors somehow. So if for every story that gets submitted you have to send in $35, that pays their editorial fees, particularly if we're talking a printed out venue or a form that is printed out, because it's getting harder to sell, particularly magazines nowadays in physical print form. So making up on that cost-wise is something that these publishers have to consider. So there's oftentimes a submission fee for the printed out versions, but the digital versions, I can't think of a single instance where I've personally seen or heard of a digital submission where you had to pay before you could send your submission. I haven't heard of it. If it exists, I haven't had any connection to it. So you submit, and then you wait, and wait, and wait. Average response time on a submission, and I don't mean the "hello, we have received your email" response. I mean an actual response from a human being, not an automated message saying we have received your email, that's where you get your delay. The longest I've ever waited is about 6.5, nearly 7 months, which isn't even as long as some places. Some venues, some publishing houses are so swamped they don't get back for 8, 9 months. A popular publishing house will be pretty swamped. And this is also why there's submission periods. It limits the amount of time when stuff can be thrown at the publishing house so that they can actually process through all of it. It's kind of an important thing for them because it keeps them in business. Because if they constantly had to deal with things coming in, they wouldn't be able to respond to everything and they'd crash and burn, essentially. So you wait after you submit. And of course, you follow the submission guidelines of the publishing house. Every publishing house is a little bit different. Most of it's the same, don't send your story in, Comic Sans with bold and underline. Don't do that. Read through the guidelines, and every publishing house has a submission guideline. Follow the guidelines, do what they ask, because it's basically making sure that it works with their system. Whether we're talking digital or print, they have a method to their madness. It seems weird to someone on the outside, but when you're on the inside of a company like that and you're looking at how the process works, it all makes perfect sense. I have experience there too. So the waiting process is basically waiting for them to get to your story, to go over it, and to draw a conclusion as to whether or not they want to publish it. The fastest response time I've ever received was a day and a half. I submitted one morning, the next day's evening I received a reply that I had been published. It was a flash fiction piece, small publishing house. That's a quick turnover for reading and determining whether they want the story to be published. My story was about 630 words. It was very, very quick, very, very short, and consequently very, very fast publication. The story that I had to wait 6.5 months on was about 8,000 words, and it was a little bit more of a drag-on process because it was larger. So the waiting period is where you kind of have this, is it going to be a little bit of time or something? How long is this going to take? You don't really know. Unless you're the editor of the publishing house, you really can't say with certainty how long the waiting period is going to be. But once you're done waiting, you're going to get a reply. And that reply is going to come in one of 3 possible forms. Either the publishers are publishing your work, in which case they will tell you, and I will continue with that next, or they're not. If they're not, this is the other 2. They're either going to send you an email saying, I'm sorry, we've chosen not to publish your work, which is the most common way that a rejection occurs. You get a polite email, we read your story, it doesn't really fit for our needs, etc., etc. Best of luck finding a venue to publish it. Regards, the editorial staff. Sometimes, however, errors do occur and you might not receive a rejection email. That's happened to me. I submitted a story a couple times. I never received a reply. I sent them an email, we're sorry, we rejected your story, but we thought we'd sent the email, blah, blah, blah. That does happen. You can send inquiries. Don't send one a day. You're just going to tick off the publishers. But if you're waiting 2-3 months, sending an inquiry email, hey, I submitted a story about 2 months ago, how's it going, have you made a decision yet, etc., etc. Be polite. So you can experience all 3 of those, where you'll get an acceptance, a rejection email, and sometimes nothing. And that's the way it goes. That's the next step after waiting. So obviously if your story's been rejected, it ends there. If your story's been published, the next step is the contract. Most publishers have a pretty standard contract. And I've gone over all this in my contract videos, though the details and nuances, etc., with those particular contracts. Some publishers have sample contracts. You can always look that stuff up. It's really good for someone interested in a publishing house to know what they're going to be getting into. Once the contract is signed, and there's really, for short stories in particular, there's very little negotiating that's going to go on because a lot of it's industry standard. If you're talking semi-pro or pro rate for a single payment, which is a semi-pro and pro rate are the payments per word. I'm going to be talking about pay rates and scales. I think I've already done a video on this one. I'm not really big into the one-time payments. I prefer royalties personally, But royalty rates generally tend to be pretty consistent, a single share per author per anthology. It's not really rocket science. There's not a lot to analyze about it. There's not a lot to negotiate. It's pretty much, hey, you got a story in there, you're going to get one share of the net after the editorial staff gets paid. So once you have the contract, you have to sign the contract. And sometimes you need a witness, sometimes you don't. But you sign it, and you can either, and check with the publisher on this one, because sometimes they wanted a physical copy mailed to them. Sometimes they're fine with a digital copy scanned into a computer and emailed to them. Check with your publisher. Obviously, when you get the contract, you're going to ask, do you want this scanned or do you want this mailed? But obviously you sign it, you get a witness to sign it if you have to, you put the date in next to your signature, and you send it off. Now comes the process of putting the full anthology together, edits and proofs from the publishers. And what that's going to mean is that you're going to get, most likely, a digital pre-draft version of how the anthology is put together. So you're going to get a digital copy of the anthology in its rough state. And you're basically going to be asked, go over your story, make sure that it's the way you want it to be, and send it back to us with everything that's... And again, every publishing house is going to be a little bit different about this one, but generally what it is you go over your work and you make sure that it's all organized and presented the way you want it presented. So you send that in. What'll usually happen next is you'll get some edits and proofs back from the editor. And basically what'll happen is they'll send you a digital copy of your story with highlight and words struck out and things added in, or like your little pair of parentheses with, hey, can you put some more description here? And this is part of the artistic negotiation, I guess you could call it, where you're basically discussing with your editor how they want your story presented. Because no story goes through unedited, unproofed the first time, period, the end. I haven't experienced it. I don't know if any other writers have really experienced it. Every time you write a story and get it published, you edit, you proof, and your editor edits and proofs as well. So the changes are very rarely drastic. It's more like, yeah, this paragraph could use a little paring down, like knock it down by 5 words, or can you give a little more detail here, or this dialogue seems weird. Never anything big. It's not, change your main character entirely, change your plot completely. You don't get that. They publish your story because they like your characters, they like your plot, and they like your structure. They just want little tweaks to make sure that it's polished enough for the final anthology. Now, then this is, bear in mind, for short stories. Novels, it's going to be a lot more negotiating, a lot more editing, proofing, the editing and proofing process, and that is a lot longer. I've known some authors who wrote novels who would work on edits and proofs for upwards of a year. But then again, these are people who lived entirely on their writing, and they could take a year because they knew they would sell 30, 40, 50, 60, 100,000 copies and make enough money to live off of while they were spending that year finagling over every sentence and paragraph in a 100,000-word novel. Anyway, once the edits and proofs are done from the editor's standpoint, and all the story is exactly as both you and the editorial staff want it, next step is going to be advertising and marketing. These days, Kickstarters and crowdfunding for anthologies is a big thing. A lot of publishers do this. I recently had a story included anthology where they had a Kickstarter for it, and we raised a couple $100 to try and promote the book, and people who donated money, I can't remember if it was if we got enough to fit the cap or not. I'd have to double check the Kickstarter. But basically, if you have someone donating money, there's all sorts of little perks and things, signed copies of the anthology, physical, digital. And crowdfunding is a great way for small publishing houses, particularly, to defray their expenses during the initial publication period, where you're not making any money, you're just getting the book out there. Now, the just getting the book out there is the next stage. This is where the publishers will send copies to critics, to reviewers, to get the word out there about the anthology. It's not an uncommon thing for publishers also to go to conventions, whether you're talking anime, sci-fi, fantasy, literature, whatever. Conventions where there are people who will read the whatever particular genre it is. If it's a horror anthology, you might have someone going to a horror convention. Obviously, that's where your market is going to be, and it's going to be basically promotion, getting the word out there about the anthology, about the book, about the publishing house. And then you, as the author, wait. Again, with the Kickstarter, and the marketing, you can play an active role. There's a lot of free advertisements that you have available to you. DeviantArt is a great place where a number of authors actually promote their work via groups that have like upwards of 1,000 members. Tumblr is another place where a lot of people advertise and promote. Facebook, obviously. Craigslist. Craigslist is a great way to get global marketing. If you want to put a picture of your story or your collection, the book that your work has been included in, you can advertise everywhere from Taiwan to Finland, Finland. I'm part Finnish and I'm saying Finland, Korea to Peru, everywhere in between. You can advertise globally, and it's free, which is great. So that's something you could take part in. You could take part in the advertising, you take part in the marketing. Once the advertising and marketing is done, you wait, because then you're just waiting for the sales to come in and for the book to accrue enough money for you to get your share of the royalties. Assuming you're going for royalties. If you're going for one-time payment, you're going to probably not even worry about the advertising and the marketing because you've already been paid. So that's kind of a pretty, I don't know how much time have I spent on this. Oh, wow, I spent a lot more time on this than I was expecting. But that's pretty much a kind of squished down synopsis of the process of submitting and getting published. As you can tell, there are a lot of steps, and the biggest steps, the longest steps are waiting. Sitting around and waiting for things to happen, sitting around and waiting for a response is a big chunk of your time, which is why writers write. While you're sitting waiting for the next story, while you're sitting waiting for your current publication to get published, you're writing your next story. It tends to be the way it works. All right, so I ramble on enough. I'd like to think that I've answered your question as not so succinctly as I was anticipating, but as succinctly enough that I've covered all the various stages that you'll have to deal with without going into too much detail. All right, let's see if I can get this correct this time. Hey, like and share, like and subscribe below. If you have any questions, comments, please email me. You can get my email through my YouTube page or through my website. Hyperlink in the description. And I'd like to start saying this too. Like and share. I've gotten some positive response. I've gotten some great fan mail from people, and if you like my videos, share them with other people. Share them with your friends. If you're connected with a writers group, please let them know about me. I'd really appreciate it. So thank you all very much, and see you next time. Cheers.